do you believe we're in a recession?
Oh, of course. That's the traditional definition economists have used for decades. You know, it'd be too precious to suddenly start trying to change the definition just because it's politically inconvenient. It's not the worst recession that's ever happened, but obviously recessions come in different sizes and shapes. This is a relatively mild one, and by the definition that economists have used, this is one.
What do you think, Craig?
Well, in fact, I disagree with the assessment that just, the benchmark is 2 quarterly contractions. There's other things that are required for a recession to take hold. And the first one is the contraction in the economy has to be significant. It also has to last for a significant length of time. And it also has to be diffused. It has to be across a wide range of industries. It can't just be concentrated in one area. So I think in actual fact, today's numbers, basically the jury's still out. And in fact, it fuels the fires for all the parties because there was a contraction, and so in 2 quarters, and that'll support people wanting to say that there's been a recession. On the other hand, I think from an analytical economist perspective, I think that there's a good chance that in fact it won't be deemed to be a recession when the final numbers are assessed.
Well, we had a recession very much like this in 1980-81, a short, shallow recession. And I agree, it was a short, shallow recession. It didn't last that long. The hit wasn't that bad compared to some of the major recessions we've had. But nobody's gone back to say, oh, that wasn't a recession after all. That's all driven by the politics of the current campaign.
If you actually look at the 80 number, it was half of what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the data, which actually is preliminary. So, but you know what? This actually doesn't matter. Economists can call it a recession or not a recession.
Yeah,
but from the average point, from the point of view of the average Canadian or for Canadian businesses, the main message is the Canadian economy basically stalled, at least in the first half of the year, and it may have indeed contracted. Yeah. The economy is weak, and it doesn't really matter what economists want to call it, in terms of how it feels. And if you look across this country, there is no question it's going to feel like a recession in Alberta. In fact, the government there is anticipating a contraction for the entire year, not just for 5 months. In the context of Ontario, Quebec, and BC, it's not even going to feel like a recession because you're actually getting moderate economic growth.
Well, but there's lots of places in Ontario and Quebec where it's felt like a recession for the last 3 or 4 years. Drive through southwestern Ontario, you never would have known that the recovery was here. So I do agree with Craig on one key point. If it had been a little above zero or a little below zero today, that's irrelevant. The fact is we have stalled and we're at or near zero. Well, and that is enormously important to our employment prospects, the fiscal affairs of government, and everything else.
I want to bring you some of the numbers that make up the overall number, and I believe we have a board prepared. So if we take a look at I just want to take a look at some of the numbers that came out today in terms of manufacturing data, in terms of business investment. Those were down significantly. Business investment in this country down about over 7%. Manufacturing data was down. There was that blip in June. Can you say this is being, as the government has said, that this is being driven solely by the oil patch, by the problems in the oil patch?
No, we've seen the data for several months now showing that across a good chunk of the economy, you're seeing at least half of the economy in zero growth or negative growth mode. Construction also shrank, manufacturing, utilities. So if you add them all up, it's something close to half of the economy that is shrinking. And the idea that it's just one sector and it's just temporary isn't sustainable. In fact, there's no evidence yet that we've even snapped out of it yet. June was a better month, obviously, but there were some special factors there. Whether we're continuing in recession in the third quarter remains to be seen.
Well, in fact, the forecasting community, including the Bank of Canada, is expecting growth in the 2.5% to 3% range in the third quarter. The U.S. economy, which is our major trading partner, grew 3.7% in the second quarter and probably more than 3% in the third quarter. Canada's, if we look at the relationship, the economic relationship between Canada and the United States, the Canadian economy is very much integrated along north-south lines. We're basically plugged into a North American economy, and it's quite exceptional for a significant deviation. So, I think that the case, I think there's a very strong case to be made that the economy was growing again in June and that it continued to grow in the third quarter. So if there was a recession, it was extraordinarily mild. It was very short. And yes, it wasn't just the energy sector, but there was, the energy sector plugs into a lot of other areas. And so you see some of the cascading effect there. So, at the end of the day, when you looked at the second quarter, 13 out of 20 Canadian industries were growing. In June, 17 out of 20 were growing. From a fiscal policy point of view, I think the challenge is that, the policy recommendation is it's already too late to respond because, quite frankly, it'll take time for any fiscal policy to work through the system.
And the government can't actually introduce fiscal policy right now.
Well, we've got this extraordinarily long election campaign when once the writ drops, the government is not supposed to take any proactive measures. So a consequence of a very long election campaign is precisely that it ties the hands of government from doing anything about it. But the government probably shares Craig's view that they wouldn't want to do anything about it. The fiscal policy can't be seen on just a quarter-to-quarter basis, though, and this is I think, an important point. We've been in austerity mode where the government's been pulling back its financial injections to the economy since 2011, and that is one of the reasons we were near zero to start with. So you're right, we can't respond to last quarter's results with a sudden injection, but we can respond to the generalized stagnation of our economic performance, and that, I think, would be required.
Let me just play with what Conservative candidate Stephen Harper had to say today to this issue and how he note two things. One, he didn't refer to a recession at all.
The R word.
The R word. Number two, he focused on June. Let's take a look.
I'll just point out exactly what the Governor of the Bank of Canada said. If you look at the data over the past year, you actually see growth in over 80% of the economy. Obviously, there have been challenges, particularly in the energy and some commodity sectors because of falling prices. But the fact of the matter is, over 80% of the Canadian economy has been growing. The Canadian economy as a whole is now growing according to the June figures.
How do you square that circle? The Canadian economy growing, and we've just gotten word that there's a recession.
Well, that's just a question of how you calculate a quarterly average. A quarter has 3 months in it. One of them was June, and it did grow in June. But the downturn in April and May was big enough to more than offset that. So the average for the quarter. Now, in other recessions, we have had a situation where you did get a month of growth, but that didn't mean the recession was over. There were, I think, good news in the June number. Some of it was unusual, though. One piece of it, half of the GDP growth was due to the oil sector rebounding after the forest fires in Alberta. That's not something that's going to carry on through the rest of the year. So it's far too early to say that this is over.
Craig, what do you think the policies that could be put in place to prevent, first of all, can the government prevent a recession like this one? Could this have been prevented by any government, in your opinion?
Oh, I suspect the answer is no, because policies in terms of, like, the Bank of Canada responded the minute it saw the weakness in oil prices. You know, Governor Polos surprised financial markets by cutting rates in January.
And in fact, may cut them again come September the 9th.
And he responded a second time, taking rates further lower because he anticipated that the numbers were going to be negative. But the problem is that the full impact of monetary policies felt over a period of 12 to 18 months. And so, you know, it's when you've already seen the weakness that you start to respond to it. And what it can do is it can help to boost growth down the road, but it actually can't prevent the contraction in the first place. In terms of fiscal policy, you know, the government has been focused on balancing the books. From an economic point of view, it didn't really matter what specific year you balance. You know, sound fiscal management says that over a period of several years, you should run balanced books. But you know, if there's a contraction, if the economy falters, if the private sector demand contracts, then there is a legitimate economic reason to run deficits to provide support to domestic demand. But the problem is, you know, what happened was you ended up with a drop in oil prices, and the drop in oil prices had a cascading effect through the Canadian economy, and then you had a 1 quarter bad quarter in the United States that hit our trading partner, and all of this manifested in a small contraction in the Canadian economy. I don't think you could anticipate the drop in oil prices. None of the forecasters got it right. In fact, they've all scrambled this year to revise their oil forecast down. So really, when you talk about the policy response, what you're really talking about is, you know, should the governments be taking action to boost economic growth down the road? And realistically, you know, any boost that the government provides is probably going to be 12 to 18 months down the road. So a lot depends on what you actually think the economic outlook is.
Yeah. What do you think? Where do you think that policy should run on a 12 to 18 month level? Where do you think the money or the policy should be created to create that long-term growth?
Well, I think there's lots of things that governments can do to improve growth. And I think in the case of Canada, one of the biggest challenges we have is we have very weak productivity and innovation and growth. And that's undermining our competitiveness.
Infrastructure as well?
Well, we have an infrastructure deficit. There's no question that Canada desperately needs. A lot of our infrastructure was put in place in the 50s and 60s. It's aging. It needs replacement. At the same time, the economy's gotten bigger. So as a result, you're seeing bottlenecks. All you have to do is look at congestion in some of our major cities, and you can see that we have an infrastructure deficit. The problem with the infrastructure, with additional infrastructure, is that it takes a long time for the boost to the economy to be felt. But understand that we do need for a productive, efficient, competitive economy, you need good infrastructure.
Where do you think it should be, Jim?
Craig's right about the delay in getting these things in motion, which is exactly why we shouldn't have been caught flat-footed in the first place. We have a situation where the government's been in austerity mode since 2011. They've pulled back $15 billion of program spending. They've eliminated tens of thousands of jobs in the broader public sector. That helped to create an environment where bad news in one sector, oil, could actually push the whole economy into negative. So I don't accept the argument that government shouldn't do anything because it's a short-term problem. Government actually helped set the stage for this recession to affect the overall economy. And so there's no time like the present to start turning that around. Put money back into public programs, invest long-term in infrastructure, not just ribbon cutting right before an election, as we've seen, but a steady long-term injection of funds for the programs that we need, and take measures that actually work to boost our business investment and exports, the key drivers of a market economy.
What about the idea of running a deficit? That's been controversial lately, but Tom Mulcair of the left saying he's going to balance the budget in the first year no matter what.
The parties are all over the place on this one. Here's the funny thing. Because we now actually have a technical recession 2 quarters in a row, even by the Conservatives' own balanced budget law that they passed just before the writ dropped, this is the time to run a deficit. So for them to stand up now and denounce deficits is funny, because they just passed a law saying if you have 2 quarters of negative growth, this is the time to run a deficit. But the deficit in and of itself isn't going to solve anything. The question is, what's behind that? Are you in fact injecting the money into the right places to offset the weakness in private demand and get the whole economy going? That's the key issue.
Yeah, I think that what we're seeing is the parties are all providing their vision as to what actions they would take to boost competitiveness, improve economic performance, create jobs and employment. They each have their own vision. And then the second dimension is, okay, so now how are you going to pay for it? And the question, are you going to pay for it and balance the books, or are you going to run a deficit for a period of time?
Well, apparently there's $5 billion there, so the chances of...
The quarterly surplus you're referring to, Carol.
Well, I'm talking about Stephen Harper saying today that they have $5 billion surplus ahead of schedule.
That was in the first quarter, which is when we pay our income taxes, okay? That's like me saying I'm in surplus on payday, right? You still have to get to the end of the week.
I think the economic performance we've seen is going to see that surplus diminish and disappear before the end of the fiscal year. So really it does come down to, the various parties making tough choices about where they would put the finite resources they have.
All right. Well, I'll be paying attention over the next how many days till the election?
50.
It's going to be a long trek.
Yeah.